The noise of the metropolis filled everything around. Cars were darting through the streets. People were hurrying along the sidewalks, paying no attention to each other. In our apartment on the 27th floor, it was so quiet that sometimes I caught myself thinking I was living in a void. Outside the windows, a panorama of the city, the sparkling lights of skyscrapers, and inside, emptiness. David, my husband, was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, as usual, completely absorbed in his work. I placed a glass of wine on the table, hoping he would at least glance in my direction. "How's it going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice cheerful. He looked up, but his attention was distant, as if he had to pull himself out of his thoughts by force. "Good. Lots of work, but it's all under control." He replied briefly and turned back to the screen. Lost in my thoughts, I didn't notice when the front door opened. Jack, David's brother, walked in. I didn't expect to see him so soon after his return from Europe. "Emily!" Jack beamed, hugging me as if he hadn't seen me in years. "I'm so glad to see you again. How are things around here?" "Same as always," I shrugged, casting a glance at David, who didn't even lift his head. "And how about you?" "Getting used to being back. I'm trying. It's harder than I thought." His smile faded slightly, and a hint of weariness flickered in his eyes. He sat down at the table, easily blending into our usual routine, as if he had always been part of this home. We chatted about simple things. How his trip went, how he was coping after the divorce. A few weeks had passed since that evening when Jack first reappeared in our home. Since then, he had been coming by more and more frequently, which made sense. After all, he and David were brothers. David said that Jack was going through a tough time after the divorce and needed time to pull himself together. That evening, Jack came over again, this time without any prior notice. David returned late and almost immediately left for a meeting with a client. I was left alone with Jack. "Is everything all right, Emily?" he asked as we sat in the living room, the cups of coffee between us growing cold on the table. "Yes, of course." I tried to smile, though I must have seemed unconvincing. He was silent for a long time, staring at me intently. "You look tired. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." I felt his words strike right at the sore spot, the one that hurt the most. I exhaled, slightly embarrassed by my reaction. This man, my husband's brother, noticed things about me that David had long since stopped seeing. "Thank you, Jack," I said softly, feeling an unexpected warmth from his concern. The moment was subtle but significant. I realized that Jack had become the one who at least made an effort to understand me. We continued talking, and I began to feel a strange sense of relief in his presence. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. Jack. He started coming over more often. Gradually, his visits stopped being just family gatherings. He came to talk to me, to help with small things, which gave me the feeling that he genuinely cared about how I was feeling. It was both pleasant and strange at the same time. One day, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, he unexpectedly came up behind me and, without saying a word, grabbed a towel to dry the clean plates. "You don't need to, Jack. I've got it," I said, casting a brief glance over my shoulder at him. "It's all right, Emily. I can help. Besides, it's a bit of a distraction." He smiled slightly. It was such a simple, mundane thing, helping out in the kitchen. But I felt something changing. His presence beside me was light, almost unnoticeable. Yet, I liked it. Unlike David, who was consumed by his own affairs, Jack stayed here, by my side, and it began to feel like something new, something unexpected. "You know, I appreciate this," I suddenly said, surprised that the words had come out on their own. "No need to thank me. We're family," he responded just as calmly, but there was a hint in his voice that made me pause. I turned away, trying to hide my slight embarrassment. Evenings with Jack had become a kind of solace for me. One evening, when Jack brought me coffee, he lingered for a moment longer than necessary for a casual, friendly gesture. His fingers barely brushed against mine as he handed me the cup. and I felt a strange spark inside. It happened so quickly, so subtly, that I could have written it off as an accident, if not for one thing. I didn't want to dismiss it. Something stirred inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. We both quickly returned to our usual conversations, but I couldn't shake the thought that Jack had become more than just my husband's brother to me. That weekend, David and I went to our country house, hoping that a change of scenery would help restore some of the closeness we had lost. On the second day, Jack showed up at the house. He had promised to come, saying he wanted to spend time with the family. The moment he walked in, it felt as though something in the house came alive, as if the air became lighter. Jack brought supplies for a barbecue and a bottle of wine, immediately creating a more relaxed atmosphere. "Emily, just look at how beautiful it is here," he said as he opened the window. "How do you not go crazy from the silence?" I laughed, feeling the tension inside me start to ease bit by bit. "Silence can be nice, but only if you have someone to share it with," I replied, casting a quick glance at David, who was sitting with his laptop on the veranda, seemingly oblivious to our conversation. Jack glanced at his brother briefly, and understanding flashed in his eyes. He said nothing, but his silent empathy spoke louder than any words. Later, Jack and I went to the garden to set up the grill. I watched him as he skillfully handled the charcoal, calm and composed, as though in this place he had found something I had been searching for, a sense of peace and balance. "I'm glad you came," I admitted, surprised by how naturally the words slipped out. "I'm glad to be here too," he replied with a smile. "I think you need a break, Em. You look tired." "Yeah, maybe," I said quietly, startled by how easy it was to talk to him. When the barbecue was ready, the three of us sat on the terrace, eating, but even Jack couldn't completely ease the tension. David talked about work, and with each comment, I was reminded of how distant we had become from one another. I looked at him, trying to remember the last time I had felt the warmth that once connected us, but I couldn't. After dinner, David went inside, leaving Jack and me outside. The quiet was broken only by the crackling of the coals in the grill. We sat on the steps of the veranda, looking out over the lake. "You know," Jack began after a long silence, "sometimes it seems to me that David has lost something important. I remember when he was different." I didn't reply. Instead, I just stared into the distance at the dark surface of the lake, where boats gently swayed. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice a strange mix of understanding and concern. I nodded, too afraid to say a word. The moment was too personal, too painful. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, surprised at my own honesty. Jack remained silent, but his presence gave me an odd sense of security. We sat together, alone with our thoughts, and the silence between us, like that evening before, felt different. A silence that didn't suffocate, but brought us closer. Night fell unexpectedly, and the air at the country house grew cooler. David had long since gone to bed, leaving Jack and me alone under the dark sky. We sat on the veranda talking about trivial things, the weather, how the lake had changed since Jack was last here. But all of it was just background to the tension that grew between us with every passing minute. "Shall we take a walk?" Jack suggested suddenly, standing up from his chair. His voice was soft, but there was a certain insistence in it, as if there was something he needed to say. I nodded, feeling my heart start to race. We walked down the path toward the lake, and the silence that accompanied us was loud, filled with something unspoken. The cool night air caressed my skin, but inside I was burning. When we reached the shore, Jack stopped, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on the still surface of the water. I didn't know what to say and was afraid that any sound would shatter this fragile moment. "Emily," he said quietly, and in his voice I heard what I had been so afraid to confront. "I can't hide it anymore. I feel something for you that I shouldn't feel." I froze. The words I had tried so hard to keep out of my thoughts were now spoken aloud. I knew I had to say something, but no words came. "Jack," I whispered, feeling the ground slip out from under me. "You know this is wrong." He turned to me and our eyes met. In his gaze, I saw everything: doubt, desire, and pain. "I know," he said, taking a step toward me. "But it's stronger than both of us. I've tried to fight it, but I can't. You feel it too. I know you do." My heart was pounding in my chest as if ready to break free. Inside me, a storm of conflicting emotions raged. My duty to David and something else I could only call passion. In that moment, everything I had been holding back broke free. "I do too," I whispered before I could stop myself. In the next instant, he took the final step toward me, and as if by instinct, I found myself in his arms. The kiss was unexpected and fierce, like a storm that had been building for so long and finally found release. I was overwhelmed by a wave of conflicting feelings: passion, guilt, fear, relief. I knew I was crossing a line, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a mistake. When we pulled away from each other, the silence between us was filled with the sounds of the night: the whisper of the wind, the gentle lapping of the water. We stood there on the shore, both realizing that this moment would change everything. "We can't," I said softly, trying to regain some sense of reason. "But something about this doesn't feel wrong," Jack replied, and strangely, his words echoed inside me. I returned to the house feeling as though every movement was slow, as if I were moving through thick air. My mind was in turmoil, and when I lay down in bed next to David, my heart was still racing. Morning came too soon. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the previous night's memories pulling me down, keeping me from truly waking up. David was still asleep next to me, his breathing even and calm. He knew nothing, and that knowledge made my chest tighten with guilt. Yet I couldn't forget the kiss with Jack, a memory that seemed to be imprinted in my mind forever. "We can't keep doing this, Jack," I said quietly as I poured myself a cup of coffee, though my voice betrayed me with a slight tremble. "I know," he replied just as softly, but there was a bitterness in his tone. He took a step toward me, but I looked away, not wanting to give in to that pull again. "David, he doesn't suspect anything," I continued, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "Emily, this isn't just an attraction," Jack said, his voice becoming firmer. "You feel it too. I see how you suffer being with him. I'm not asking you to do anything right now, but don't pretend that nothing is happening." "It's just a moment of weakness," I whispered, as if trying to convince myself more than him. Jack sighed, and in his eyes, I saw that familiar mix of pain and compassion that made his presence unbearably compelling. "If that's true, I'll leave," he said, looking directly into my eyes. "But if you know this is more than that, don't lie to yourself or to me." I didn't respond. My thoughts were a mess, and every word he said made the pressure inside me grow stronger. I had no idea how to deal with any of this. The whole day passed in a tense silence, and each time I saw Jack or felt his gaze, everything inside me churned. But what was worse was realizing that David noticed nothing. He remained as absorbed in his work as always, and the distance between us only deepened my inner turmoil. When we returned home to the city, I felt even worse. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of dread, as if something inevitable was hanging in the air. I tried to distract myself, burying myself in routine tasks, but everything came back to one thing: Jack and that moment by the lake. I couldn't forget him. Each day, the feeling inside me grew stronger, no matter how hard I tried to suppress it. David, as usual, was lost in his work, his detachment now seeming like the norm. I began to realize that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The life that once seemed perfect was starting to fall apart. Jack stopped coming over as often, and it felt like the right thing to do. But doing the right thing isn't always easy. I knew it would be better for everyone, but my heart resisted. Every time I heard the phone ring or the sound of the front door opening, my breath quickened. The anticipation of seeing Jack was agonizing, but his absence was even worse. Several days passed, and I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. The internal conflict had gone on for too long. One evening, when David was working late again and the weight of the night pressed down on me, I picked up my phone and sent Jack a short message. "Can we talk?" His response came within minutes. "I'll be there in half an hour." I sat on the couch, feeling the tension inside me build with every passing second. When the doorbell rang, I froze, needing a moment to gather the strength to stand. But finally, I opened the door, and there stood Jack. Calm as always, but there was something different in his eyes, something serious. "Hi," he said softly, stepping inside. "Hi," I replied, feeling my resolve begin to melt away. We sat in the living room, and I didn't know how to start the conversation. The silence, which usually felt comforting, was now unbearable. "Jack, I can't ignore this anymore," I finally said, breaking the silence. He looked at me with the same attention and understanding that made him so different from David. I felt like I could talk to him about anything, that I wasn't alone when I was with him. "I can't either," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "This is dangerous. For all of us," I continued, feeling the fear tighten inside me. Jack shifted on the couch, turning to face me. His gaze was focused, and I knew he was ready for whatever I was about to say. "I thought I could stop this." My voice was barely above a whisper, but every day it gets harder. "I think about you all the time, and no matter how much I try, I can't change that." I didn't look at him, but I could feel the tension in the room becoming almost tangible. Jack sat still, and I was afraid to meet his gaze. "Emily," he finally spoke, "I feel the same. I've known for a while, but I wanted to give you time. I didn't want to make things harder for you, but I can't hide my feelings anymore." He paused, and I felt his words stir a flood of emotions inside me that I had been holding back for far too long. "I love you," he said, and the words shattered the silence. They were simple, but they held the truth I had been running from for so long. I remained silent, unsure of how to respond. Inside me, a storm was raging. I knew that acknowledging his confession could destroy everything David and I had built, but I also knew I could no longer ignore what was happening between Jack and me. "I can't deny it," I whispered, finally lifting my eyes to meet his. "But what do we do? This is wrong, but I don't think I can fight it anymore either." Jack leaned in slowly, took my hands in his, and quietly said, "We need to decide what we want. I don't want to pressure you, but if you feel the same way, we need to be honest. With ourselves and with David." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of the entire situation. Honesty. Honesty that could destroy everything. I didn't know if I was ready for that. One evening, everything changed. It was a day like any other. David returned home late from work, as usual. We were having dinner when the doorbell rang. I knew who it was. Jack, as always, had come without warning. My anxiety surged instantly. "I'll get it," I said quickly, but to my surprise, David stood up first. Jack stood at the door, and in that moment, an unbearable silence filled the room. Their eyes met, and I could feel the tension rise to its breaking point. Jack seemed momentarily unsure, but he stepped forward as if determined not to retreat. "What's going on?" David asked suddenly, his voice cold and firm. My heart stopped. The words stuck in my throat. I tried to say something, but nothing came out. David's eyes flicked between me and Jack, and I saw the realization dawn on him, the understanding that something was wrong. He wasn't a fool, and I could see the sudden flash of comprehension in his gaze. "Is there something between you?" he asked, his voice filled with a muted fury. "David, let's talk," I began quietly, feeling everything inside me tighten. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think." His voice grew louder, and I saw his hands ball into fists. "You're standing next to my brother, and I see it. Do you really think I haven't noticed?" He took a step toward me, and in his eyes, I saw not just anger, but deep, raw pain. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I knew I had to say it. I have feelings for Jack," I said, and it was like a lightning strike on a clear day. The words came out sharply, taking everyone by surprise. In that moment, I saw a shadow of shock pass over David's face. His lips tightened and his eyes hardened. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice icy. It's recent." I could barely speak, crushed by the weight of his reaction. "But I don't know what to do, David. We've grown apart. We lost each other." David was silent for a few seconds, and the quiet was worse than shouting. Then he turned to Jack. "And you, my brother," he said with bitter venom. How long have you been waiting to betray me? David, it wasn't intentional, Jack began, but David cut him off. Not intentional? You came into my home, sat at my table, and all the while… He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice shaking. I trusted you, Jack. David didn't say anything more. He turned sharply and headed for the door. I wanted to stop him, but I knew that at that moment he wasn't ready to listen or talk. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Jack and me standing in the shattered remains of our lives. I stood there in the silence, feeling like everything inside me was tearing apart. We had destroyed everything. After that night, everything changed. David never came home, and I had to accept that this moment had been the final straw for our marriage. The next day, I received a message from him. Short, cold, and to the point. He asked me to pack my things and leave the apartment. The following day, he filed for divorce. I sat on the bed, which had once felt like a refuge from the world, staring at the suitcases I couldn't bring myself to start packing. Everything around me felt familiar, yet strangely foreign. My life was falling apart, and with it, so were my ideas about myself, about marriage, about love. Jack offered to help, but I refused. I knew I had to sort through everything on my own. What had once been simple between us suddenly became complicated. His presence, which had once brought me comfort, now filled me with guilt and uncertainty. Guilt for betraying David and doubt about whether there could ever be a future for Jack and me. One evening, Jack came over to talk. We both knew the conversation was inevitable. How are you? He asked softly, sitting across from me on the couch. I don't know, I replied honestly. Everything feels wrong. I don't know what to do next. Emily, he began, trying to sound confident, though I could see he was struggling too. We could try to start over. I understand how you feel right now, but I love you, and that hasn't changed. I stayed silent, trying to collect my thoughts. Yes, there had been a strong attraction between us, but ever since David left, that attraction had begun to crumble under the weight of reality. The reality that our relationship had been built on betrayal, on pain. And with each of our meetings, I felt more and more that something new was forming between Jack and me. Something not rooted in passion, but in something much more painful. Jack, I said softly, finally meeting his eyes. I'm not sure we can be together. His face paled and he frowned. Are you serious? He asked, disbelief clear in his voice. I'm serious. Everything that's happened, it's destroyed both of us. I feel it every time we talk. We've tried to build something on the ruins, but I'm not sure it's possible. I don't want to live with this weight anymore. He fell silent, lowering his head. I could see him struggling to accept what I was saying, but I also knew he understood me. There was too much unsaid between us, too much pain. The guilt over what had happened with David was eating away at both of us, like rust corroding everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our relationship would always be overshadowed by it. Maybe you're right, he finally said, his voice quiet and filled with exhaustion. I feel it too. We both made mistakes, and now we're living with the consequences. I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. We sat in silence, understanding that this was the end. The end of a story that should never have started. I need to rebuild my relationship with David, if that's even possible, Jack continued, staring into the distance. And you probably need time to figure things out for yourself. I nodded again. It was the only right decision. We both knew that we couldn't continue like this. After that conversation with Jack, I was left alone. Our final meeting had left a deep emptiness in my soul, but strangely enough, it also brought a sense of relief. I realized that this was an inevitable point we had both been moving toward, even if we tried to delay it. Now I had to deal with the consequences, but without looking back at anyone else. I moved out of the apartment where I had lived with David for so many years. As I packed my things, I understood how little material objects really mattered. Everything that had once connected us was now part of the past, just like the apartment full of memories, which no longer had space for me or our story. My life felt like it was starting from a blank slate, but that slate was still too white and cold to write anything on it. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the place where I had once been part of a glittering world filled with career ambitions and endless promises of success. Every day passed in a routine, and I sought my salvation in that routine. I needed time to figure out who I was, without David, without Jack, without everything that had defined me for the past few years. Months went by. I didn't speak to Jack or David. Each of us went our separate ways. The time I spent alone turned out not to be as frightening as I had imagined. It gave me the chance to think about what truly mattered. I learned to be honest with myself, no longer hiding behind excuses or self-deception. I had to accept my role in what had happened, but with that acceptance came the understanding that I couldn't live in the past. One evening, I was sitting on my balcony, breathing in the cool air and watching the sunset. Everything was calm, and I felt the storm inside me finally beginning to quiet down. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not the fleeting joy that accompanies the euphoria of passion, but a deep, steady lightness that came from the beginning of self-forgiveness. At that moment, I received a message from David. He was brief. I signed the papers. I hope you find your happiness. Those words, free of blame and resentment, stirred something important within me. I knew it wasn't just a formality. It was his acknowledgement that we both deserved to start a new life. I replied simply, "Thank you. I hope you find yours too." With that simple exchange of messages, I realized that I had begun to let go of the past. Not in an instant. Not like magic, but step by step, slowly and carefully. I now understood that you can't run from your mistakes. You have to accept them and move forward, no matter how difficult the path. As for Jack, I didn't know if he would be able to rebuild his relationship with his brother. I hoped so, but I understood that it was their story, and I no longer had a place in it. Jack and I hadn't spoken since that day, and perhaps that was the right decision. Our paths had diverged, and that was part of the process of forgiveness that I had to go through. Now, I was living my own life, rebuilding it brick by brick. The road ahead wasn't easy, but with each day, I felt like I was rediscovering myself. The past would stay with me, but it no longer dictated how I should live. I knew that somewhere ahead was a new chapter, full of its own challenges and joys, and I was ready for it. Another year passed, and life around me slowly began to take on new shapes. Time doesn't heal instantly, but it offers a way to rethink everything that's happened and move forward, step by step. With each new morning, I learned to accept what had occurred, not running from the past, but no longer letting it dictate my future. My new apartment had truly become a sanctuary. It was quiet here, and that silence no longer frightened me as it once had. On the contrary, in solitude, I found the strength I had been lacking. I began painting again, just as I had in my youth when art was my way of expressing everything I couldn't say aloud. The paintings that appeared on the canvas reflected not only my thoughts and emotions, but also the journey I had taken over this time. One day, while walking through the city, I ran into an old friend. We hadn't seen each other in years, and our chance encounter was an unexpected reminder of how life sometimes brings people together at the most unforeseen moments. "Emily, I can't believe it's you." She laughed, hugging me. "It's been so long. How are you?" "I'm doing well." I smiled, realizing that for the first time, those words felt true. We sat down in a small cafe, and the conversation flowed easily, just like in the old days. I didn't dive into the details of everything that had happened in my life over the past few years, but I told her I had started a new chapter. She listened attentively and then suddenly asked, "Are you happy?" The question lingered in the air, and I paused for a moment. Was this happiness? My life no longer had the dramatic highs and lows that had once marked my time with David and Jack. There were no more intense emotions, passions, or heartache that had consumed me before. But something had shifted. I realized that happiness doesn't always come with thunder and fireworks. "Yes," I answered, smiling. "I'm happy. In my own way." These words surprised even me. I hadn't noticed when that feeling had arrived, but it was real. It wasn't tied to anyone else or dependent on external circumstances. It came from within. The past was still with me, but it no longer controlled my life. My friend nodded, and we continued talking about other things. But that moment was a turning point for me. I had finally freed myself from the chains I had once placed upon myself. The next day, I received an unexpected message from Jack. It was a simple, "Hey, how are you?" But I sensed a different tone behind those words, one that wasn't the same as before. He had changed too. We met a few days later in a small park. Jack looked different, calmer, more composed. He approached me with a smile, like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. "Emily," he began, a little hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened." I nodded, understanding that this conversation was necessary, even after all this time. "I've thought about it too," I replied. "I'm glad we found the strength to let each other go." Jack smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his expression, and I realized it hadn't been easy for him either. "I wanted to tell you that things between me and David, they're not the same as they were, but we've started talking. I hope that one day we can get through this." His words brought me unexpected relief. I knew their relationship would never fully recover, but the possibility that they were at least trying gave me hope. "That's good news," I said, smiling.